All right, and we are live on the air. Hi, and welcome to the App Show, a live cloud accounting webcast about the latest in accounting technology and industry trends. I'm your moderator, Blake Oliver, and it's great to be back here for Season 2. We took a break during the busy season, and now we've rebooted the show in a slightly different format. We've moved from Blab over to Google Hangouts, and we've also got some fresh faces for you. So I'd like to introduce them now. Joining me, as always, is Will Lopez of AdvisorFi, hailing from the Sunshine State of Florida. Will runs a virtual online accounting firm and is one of my favorite examples of a young accountant who is doing everything right, particularly with your awesome website, Will, and even built his own custom application to interact with his clients, which is really cool, and I hope we get to talk about that on one of these shows. We've also got new to the show, Dan Fairbairn of Ocius Digital. He is joining us from Melbourne, Australia, where it is bright and early in the morning. So thank you for getting out of bed and getting dressed, Dan. We appreciate that. And Dan's firm is one of the premier cloud integrator companies in Australia and serve large number of accounting firms in helping them get their clients onto Xero and Xero add-ons. And lastly, but not least, we've got Matt Flanagan of Bluehub. He's joining us from over in the UK. And Bluehub is also a cloud integrator firm specializing in Xero and the Xero ecosystem. So it's great that we've got some cloud integrators. We've got myself and Will doing outsourced accounting services, so hopefully we've got a broad perspective across the whole globe for you today. So I really want to get right to it because we've got a great question to start things off with the new season. And that question is really relevant right now, given the recent announcements that Xero has been making. I don't know if you guys heard, but Xero just announced a partnership with Wells Fargo to do a direct integration here in the States, which is pretty big news. We've never had a bank that size do it. They've also had a rapid growth globally, but have kind of slowed down a little bit in the U.S. So the big question is, how is Xero doing? And I'd love to get your take on that in each of your respective zones, right? In Australia, in the UK, here in the US. So I thought we would start things off, Dan, since Australia and New Zealand is sort of Xero's home base, maybe you could tell us how things are going there with Xero and adoption.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really interesting time. So, what we're seeing down here, we've been operating for probably about 3 years or so. Probably 2 or 3 years ago, I think most of the accounting firms, most of the bookkeepers, rolling people onto Xero, apart from some of the real early adopters, were probably those guys that were more the easy ones, as I would call them. So kind of small trust funds, small trading entities. What we're starting to see now from some of our advisors is some much bigger operations rolling onto Xero. There's much more requirement for kind of end-to-end solutions. So in some of these add-on kind of spaces, and we're regularly now getting 10, 20, up to 50 mil turnover businesses that previously had no way of looking at Xero. I saw obviously the Wells Fargo news a couple of days ago, which I'd be interested in a minute to get the kind of US take on, because obviously over here pretty much you're on the flip side, where if a bank is not integrating to Xero, that's the outlier, and that's the unusual one. I know from a couple of our guys over here that have set up things in the US and set up US entities for importing, that trying to choose a bank that had integration to Xero was a bit of a challenge. So seeing that one is huge, and I'll kind of pass back to the accountants to comment on the annual report, because that's probably above my level. But certainly I think we're seeing a maturity in the possible solutions, definitely, and we're regularly getting kind of much bigger revenue businesses now able to look at Xero.
So that's interesting to me, the idea that it's strange in Australia for a bank not to integrate with Xero, whereas here, I think we only have one or two that do it right now. I recently listened to a podcast about how there's a bank called Tyro, I believe it's called, in Australia that has a two-way integration with Xero. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. So Tyro have started out. Tyro are. It's an interesting one, and I should be careful what I say here because I don't represent Tyro. But their class technically is kind of a digital bank. So they're not a bank as in you won't find branches or similar. They started off. They're kind of known over here being a payment provider. So if you're using a point of sale solution or something like that, they're quite a common provider of like the chip and pin type transactions. The government over here recently relaxed payment rules and banking rules, so that now essentially Tyro can be a virtual bank account, which is really cool. I know as well one of the banks in New Zealand, I think it's BNZ, is also testing two-way integration. So as well as downloading bank feeds, giving someone the ability to mark bills in Xero to pay, and then that goes to essentially the owner of the business to approve to pay up. It's an interesting space. I think it's one that will get probably a majority of people's back up a little bit, because I think immediately people start thinking, whoa, hang on, staff can pay themselves, people can pay bills. But certainly over here, like superannuation, so like pension payments over here are all automated anyway. So, quarterly I get a message with a code from our bookkeeper to put into Xero to authorize the payment. And actually, that's now government mandated. So from July 1, you can't pay super non-digitally, if that makes sense. You have to pay it through that way. So I think it's inevitable.
So that's interesting. So do you think that more banks are going to move to that? And is that something that's unique to Xero right now?
It's the two-way is definitely unique. I think certainly I think more banks will move towards that. I've got a feeling there'll be one or two leading banks, as in leading digitally, probably smaller banks, that will go first and do the hard work of working out how the hell do you make this thing secure and how do you put rules in place and so on. I think the Wells Fargo thing is interesting, and as you said, it's kind of surprising to you that all the Australian banks have bank feeds. I think people over here get stunned when we talk about the fact that like the US has no central banking system. So the fact that like Bill.com exists and you pay to receive money is just a completely alien concept. And I think that's an interesting one to see how Xero will get over that. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is Wells Fargo the biggest bank in the US, or one of? Like, it's certainly a big name I've heard of.
We sort of have a big three, right? It's I believe Chase is the largest, and B of A, Bank of America, and then Wells Fargo. It's certainly in the top three.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. So I mean, does Xero have? What's the competition like for Xero in Australia? Is there really competition in the cloud there? I know there's MYOB.
Yeah, you've got MYOB kind of have as I suppose the equivalent of the QuickBooks or the Sage in the UK as the big desktop incumbent. They kind of made a move to cloud about 2 or 3 years ago, but in the sense of just trying to pick up their desktop product and put it on a website, and kind of burnt quite a few people with that. QuickBooks Online is certainly picking up, and QuickBooks Online is certainly, from our end, talking as not an accountant, is becoming an interesting proposition because it's integrating now to a huge amount of the add-ons that Xero integrates to, so we've got transferable knowledge there. MyOb was just like QuickBooks in the US. It was 80-90% of the market. The interesting one over here, which I'm not going to get into because we'll be here all day, is that there was a reseller. So QuickBooks Enterprise, as you guys would know it, the Intuit product, was resold in Australia as exactly the same product by a different company. So there's been an interesting interrelationship there. They had effectively like a reseller right. But yeah, certainly, I mean, I think New Zealand-wise, I think Xero's up towards 30-40% of market now, and New Zealand being such a small country, like the rest, I think will roll fairly quickly. Certainly, like on the ground, I think they're past early adopter, well past early adopter, and probably getting towards the middle to end of early majority.
All right. Well, that's interesting to hear because I've always thought that Australia and New Zealand were, 3 to 5 years ahead of the U.S. in terms of cloud adoption and technology adoption. So I'm curious to see if the U.S. Tracks um, along right the same trajectory if we follow that path. So uh, thank you, Dan. And speaking of the U.S., let's keep moving. I guess we'll move westward, or eastward, I should say, across the globe. And we'll talk to Will Lopez of AdvisorFi
Yeah.
about his use of Xero. And Will, I'd love to hear how you're using Xero in your practice, and just more generally, how you see Xero doing in the U.S. market, which, as we've discussed, is very different.
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting to hear because here in the United States, it really is a fractured marketplace, like you had just mentioned. Paying for something like Bill.com, where in Australia it's really a centralized banking system. It really is two fundamentally differently structured ways of doing business, right? Here in the United States, almost everything is fractured. Banking system is very fractured. The way you do business in every state is fractured from the other state. I'm surprised to hear that even Xero has 40 or 30, 40% market share there in Australia. Over here, QuickBooks enjoys 80% of the market share with 29 million small business owners, and it just keeps growing. Um, and obviously over here, I mean, there's just a lot of competition cloud-based. You got Wave Accounting, you got Xero, you got QuickBooks Online, you got Zoho. I mean, there's just a dozen or 2 dozen. What is that? What's that one? 16 hats or 17 hats or something like that that's out there.
17 heads, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say. So I mean, even in the cloud accounting space, highly fractured. The way we use Xero is obviously, at least in the United States, you gotta stick to a couple players, and whatever works you stick with. So the tried and true is the QuickBooks, right? But then Xero is becoming tried and true, infinitely better than the QuickBooks platform, more reliable, I would say, and more intuitive. I kind of liken the Xero to the Apple and the QuickBooks to like the PC, where PC is dominating the marketplace, but Apple's offering something very unique, very high class, and it's for an acquired taste only. And I feel like Xero is kind of that. It's kind of very unique, very very intuitive, very innovative, kind of for a different taste and palate. And it's not really kind of meant to be. I mean, it's meant to be mass audience for sure, but it really is meant to provide high quality cloud-based accounting, and its fixation is on that. And I think in the end they'll end up dominating because just like Apple's become very very different, like the Teslas of the world. I think Xero will enjoy that differentiator in the marketplace here in the United States, even though here in the U.S. it's just highly fractured from top to bottom, from government all the way down to things like accounting.
So that brings up an interesting issue, which is how small business owners decide what software to use here, because we have so many options. We have QuickBooks, like you said, we have Xero, we have FreshBooks, Wave, Less Accounting, like you said, 17 hats. There's all these different applications that do invoicing that
Right.
some people would consider to be accounting software, since we don't have the same rigorous requirements for financial statements here in the U.S., right? You just have to track, most businesses just track their income and expense.
Yeah.
So this is something I've noticed, which is that in my discussions with accountants elsewhere in the world, which is that small business owners elsewhere outside of the U.S. tend to buy accounting software based on their accountant's recommendation. And they tend to have an accountant who they talk to more than once a year, because there are more compliance checkpoints throughout the year in other places. I think a lot of that is to do with taxes. People have to collect sales taxes on like professional services elsewhere in the world, and we don't. So we only have like an annual compliance requirement, and so you may only talk to your accountant once a year, right? So I'm curious, Matt. I want to bring you in on this. What So are people? How often does a small business owner talk to their accountant in the UK? It's more than once a year, right?
I would say on average it's once a year, but these early adopters of the cloud are utilizing the compliance efficiencies now in order to be able to speak on a regular basis about up-to-date finances. So I think now this is where the early adopters of the cloud are starting to see the value of having the real-time data, which means they can talk about the business today or just the previous quarter or the previous month, even so if they've reconciled up to the recent month. Whereas obviously previously you sort of got an idea of your figures sort of 15 months after year start, financial year start. So I think now this whole world of feeding data real time, whether it be add-ons, utilizing the efficiencies of bank feeds, etc. I think now the clever accountants and the ones who can see the future a bit more so and have got the crystal ball and can see where the sector can go, I think they're looking and saying, I can utilize this tool to actually speak a lot more frequently to my businesses that are under my guidance. And I think the other thing being is some of these add-ons can also be really clever to give the accountants some intelligence to talk to the business. So what I mean by that is some of the reporting add-ons, for example, they will tell you when you haven't hit a revenue threshold for the month. So they may email you to say they're down 15% on their average revenue, which then gives you a point to give them a call and say, what's going on, guys? Is there a problem? Oh no, we just got to have we're going to have a heavy month for invoicing next month. But again, that point of having a discussion and someone actually looking at your accounts and seeing there's a problem, whether it's the software guiding you, the business doesn't know that. So ultimately, I think there's a real lot of value that they can start to add, and this software, this whole world is going to give them the tools to do that.
So I agree with you 100%. And the thing I'm not clear on in the UK is the specific requirements for filing taxes, right?
Yep.
So you guys have value-added tax, is that right?
Yeah, we have quarterly VAT, which can run on different quarters. Now, but you don't need to engage an accountant to run that. So, for example, in Xero, as long as you reconcile for the quarter, you can run the VAT return, and it will file directly to UK HMRC. So that removes the conversation with the accountant, unless you've got a query over your VAT return.
But see, that's interesting to me because I see that is a requirement that we don't have in the U.S. We do quarterly estimated taxes, but you can get away with fudging that. You don't have to reconcile your books. And so I feel like that quarterly requirement to reconcile is a big reason why somebody would adopt some really solid accounting software like Xero that does a full reconciliation, not something like FreshBooks, which is really just tracking income and expense but not doing a reconciliation.
I think sorry, Blake.
Yeah. No, please go ahead.
And what I was going to say is, I think the fudging pre-cloud software for accounting, I think you can still fudge those numbers by doing a basic calculation of income and expense. But at the year end, there'd be an overall VAT reconciliation, so you might have a bigger VAT bill at the end of the year. But ultimately, you're paying for as you go, and you've got a clear understanding. Of course, you can review that VAT return quarterly, so you can make sure that you're collecting that VAT in order to pay it when needed.
Okay, so that's interesting. So, Will, go ahead.
I was going to say, is it my understanding, Matt, or I think either in the UK or Australia, that Xero has like a tax module as well besides the VAT? Like, is it like an annual tax preparing module inside somewhere?
That's only over in the Australasian area. The UK haven't got that at the moment, no. I believe, anyway. I might be talking for Dan here.
Yeah, Dan can enlighten us.
No, you're right. So there's so I'd almost split it into the two areas. So quarterly, so we've got GST just like VAT in the UK. So GST, depending on the size of company, you either file it. So if you're a bigger company, you generally file it monthly because the government wants your money quicker. Otherwise, it's filed quarterly. Over here, you can, a little bit like Matt said, you can self-file, but I would say the culture is that that's rare that people self-file. Certainly for small business, it's very rare. It might be fear of the ATO and getting it wrong. Yearly, then, yes, there is like company tax, income and personal tax returns and things. There is zero tax. So Xero purchased Workflow Max, and they have Practice Manager, which partners over here use to run their business. That has zero tax. So I could be wrong here, but I'm 90% sure. As a business owner, you can't access zero tax like to do it for yourself. You have to be an official advisor and CPA. So although it's there, I read somewhere, it may have been, I think it was Schulte on Digital First. I read some really interesting things that I'd fire back in a minute to the US guys about kind of the differences in the US market. So you're spot on, Blake, that certainly over here, an accountant's recommendation is worth its weight in gold. I read something saying that the huge proportion, I think we may have talked about it when we caught up actually, but the huge proportion of US businesses that don't have an advisor or don't have an accountant, because a lot of stuff they can self-file and self-do. I think given the similar kind of requirements in the UK, as in the quarterly tax and yearly tax, I think the UK will be the really, really interesting one. So Xero flew out the gates in New Zealand. You've got a small amount of people in a very small area, and it's a great little test bed. In Australia, you've got, I think, 24 million people in an area of the space of the US. So, like, selling to someone and then selling to their neighbor can be quite a costly exercise. In the US, you've got a lot of fractures, like you said. The UK, I think, is a fascinating one because you've got a relatively tiny little space with 65 million people in. Like, you can set fire to that pretty damn quickly.
So this is very interesting to hear, because this is confirming my suspicions, and let me tell you my theory, and you guys can tell me if you agree. So my theory is that Xero has done really well in Australia and New Zealand because, like Dan said, there is a much tighter relationship with accountants and bookkeepers there due to the more frequent requirements to be compliant and to file. And so Xero has done a really, really good job of convincing accountants and bookkeepers to get on the platform and use it for all their clients. So that's been very effective in places where people have a tighter relationship with their accountant. Here in the US, they really don't. Most small business owners don't talk to their accountant other than for taxes, and they don't really rely on the recommendation of the accountant for decisions on what software to use. So even though Xero has done a great job of recruiting accountants and bookkeepers to be partners, it's not as effective. And so that's why the growth has been slower. I guess the other reason would be the lack of certain specific features that are needed unique to the US. I mean, I remember when Xero started here, they didn't have a check printing feature, and that was a deal breaker for quite a long time. So, Will, would you agree with that assessment? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that assessment. I mean, it sounds like in the UK and Australia, I mean, you guys have the luxury that you're able to engage a client more regularly than we do. I mean, sadly enough to say, I mean, there's even people here in the United States that will go years without talking with an accountant, even though they're business owners. Yeah, I mean, and so, I mean, it sounds like, obviously, if you think about it, it's the government requirements that's almost driving the client relationship and the accountant relationship tighter and tighter together. So as, let's say, the government has stringent rules or quarterly requirements or monthly requirements, it almost causes the business owner to drive themselves towards a good accounting relationship, because, hey, if I have to do this monthly or quarterly, I better find someone good, and it's gonna be of value. Over here, it's not so much. I mean, obviously, we live in a country that's very anti-government. I would say, people are scared of the government, and there's kind of, they're kind of like trying to fly underneath the radar type of thing, and really the only requirements for the most part is an annual tax return. And I would agree with Blake's assessment. I think that's probably why the uptick here in the United States is Xero is basically, you know, while looking at their annual report, I wouldn't say lackluster, but not as aggressive as it has been in probably when they got traction in the UK and New Zealand.
Yeah,
I think they can overcome that, though. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but do you have any numbers that you wanted to share from the annual report?
No, I mean, when you read their annual report, I mean, they say they grew their subscription revenue by 81%. You know, Xero is being used in 180 countries, more than 475,000 customers. You know, they talk about their new geography being the United States, and it's experiencing growth consistent to their expectations. Obviously, they're going to say something like that. You know, but I think a lot of their play here in the U.S. is aligning with big partners like Wells Fargo Bank. You know,
Right.
so if they can get big partners like Wells Fargo Bank or Chase Bank or Bank of America to jump on board with, let's say, either one-way integration or two-way integration, I think they'll consume a big portion of the marketplace. But I don't think they'll consume as much if they were to roll something like Xero Tax here in the United States, because that is such a pain point here in the United States. That is, if Xero could do your accounting and do your tax return, I think there would just be an absolute influx. I mean, they would probably double, triple, quadruple their user base here in the United States, because I think if it can remediate that problem, obviously going to step on toes like myself and like Blake or, you know, other virtual accounting firms, but that's really the pain point. And if you can solve that pain point, I think you can really drive your user base up double, triple, quadruple digits because of that pain point.
I think as well, just to add to that, in the UK, I think we've had a directive from HMRC, obviously the government here, that 2020 every business has to have a digital footprint in the accounting space. Now, I think smaller businesses, so if you're under 87,000, I think it is around that mark, of turnover a year, you don't have to file VAT. You're not VAT registered, so VAT's of no concern. So actually, there's going to be a point, I think, where HMRC are going to open themselves up as they already have. We can self-file our VAT each quarter. I think they're going to be a point where you can self-file your whole annual return, and HMRC are going to open that. So they've had this medium and conduit of accountants for hundreds of years. They could ultimately start to lose that actual what's been sort of the mainstay of the work, you know, processing the data and then producing the accounts. I think there's an element where we can see in the UK that could actually reduce significantly, and they'll just say use the likes of Xero to file directly to us, and we'll work from there.
Well, that is a really interesting thought, Matt, and that's essentially what we've got here in the U.S. with, you know, TurboTax integrating with. I think TurboTax integrates with QuickBooks Online, and right, it's into both Intuit products. So, yeah, there are a lot of people that just do their own taxes on the self-prepare platforms, and it's an interesting thought, and I think actually that would be a great topic for a future app show. Is, you know, are accountants going to be automated? Right, that's what everyone's talking about, and I think you and Dan in particular, as cloud technology experts, I would love to pick your brains on that.
Yeah. Okay, we'll see. Yep.
All right. Well, we are coming up on the 30-minute mark, and so I think this is a good place to stop and hold it for next time. So thank you, everyone, for watching, and if you're watching the recording, thank you for checking us out on our YouTube channel. This is the June 2006 episode. We're going to do this monthly, so look for us on Google Plus and Google Hangouts and YouTube in July. We'll be announcing that date. So thanks, everyone, for watching, and I'm going to stop the broadcast now.
Cheers all.